Hey guys, it's John. You're on the JRB Tree Climbing channel. Today we're going to talk about self-rescue recovery from the Garda Hitch Footloop. I've got a dedicated playlist and I've got a dedicated page on my website, jrbtreeclimbing.com, dedicated to my Garda Hitch Footloop. The Garda Hitch Footloop is something we used as a footloop, but we also use it as a redundant point of connection when climbing. I've got a redundant bridge and we connect it to the Garda Hitch via this loop here we call the best friend. I've also got this other auxiliary loop I use to transform its length, and we're going to talk about self-rescue scenarios for the Garda Hitch. 4 scenarios, and even if you don't use the Garda Hitch, you're likely to learn something if you watch this video and you watch the video I did entitled Self-Rescue After Loss of Footing. All of the scenarios I'm going to show you today don't involve having anything under my feet. And the simple reason is because I can't guarantee there will be anything under my feet. If you look at the way accidents unfold, there's typically a failure sequence of events, and one thing leads to another, basically. And knowing that my footing, my platform, or my stick could potentially disappear and leave me in a situation where I have nothing under my feet, or I might just be rope climbing to begin with, I will exercise all of these scenarios with nothing under my feet. I will be executing these scenarios on a single rope. If you're interested in my doubled or DSRT technique, I've already covered this in a video that you will find on the DSRT playlist and the one on safety and self-recovery. There is some a priori knowledge. I will leave links in the video description. You need to know how to create this device. You need to know how to tie a friction hitch. You need to think about what could go wrong. You need to carry emergency supplies, such as a piece of cordage to make an emergency friction hitch if you ever needed to. You might need a knife in certain situations. I've never needed a knife, but knowing how problems have unfolded for others, I proactively carry one, and I have it cinched in my emergency supply bag on my left hip. Okay, let's get started. And the first thing you need to be aware of as I take off my bridge that I use as a set of suspenders is that I always use 2 bridges on my saddle. I've got a long bridge. That's the one that supports my body weight under almost all scenarios. And I've got a short bridge. The exact design, as I've experimented with a number in the course of my channel, that's not a big deal. But ideally, we're able to adjust the length of these bridges to get in an optimal climbing position. I'll be climbing first on what I consider to be a relatively long bridge as my primary, and my backup bridge, well, I'm going to make that pretty short. So let's get started. Okay, let's start a very short SRT climb. I'm only going to be a few feet off the ground. I've got my Garda Hitch Footloop around my foot. I've got my redundant bridge connected to the best friend loop, and I've got my main bridge attached to my friction device, in this case, a Longhorn Agile hitch. An SRT climb would typically just go this way. Okay, so I'm high enough off the ground to demonstrate this scenario. Normal SRT scenario, I've got my long Garda, I've got my long bridge. What would happen if this friction hitch started to slip? Let's simulate that. I'm going to simulate that by breaking the Longhorn Agile. It's sliding, it's sliding, it's sliding. Well, if you've got your system tuned properly in terms of the dimensions, at this point, my best friend is starting to take load, and I've stopped. I still got another foot here. And so if you wound up in this situation due to a friction hitch failure, maybe you didn't tie it properly, maybe it was wet, it doesn't matter. If it failed completely, well, I would find myself attached to the rope via my best friend. And I could stay here indefinitely, and I can retie this friction hitch. Now, I'm not going to go through every permutation and every scenario and what friction hitch you would use. You know, you might, if this cord was broken, well, then you might need to reach into your bag and get your replacement. You might want to add another wrap to the friction hitch you're using. If you're using a mechanical device, well, you might want to swap that out and put in a friction hitch. Those are details. Those are tools already in your toolbox. But I just retied my friction hitch. I can change the length of my bridge as appropriate, whatever I need to do to get back on this and resume my climb. And here I am, I've recovered. I didn't have to come down to recover. The safest thing to do was to recover in the tree. Okay, scenario 2, I'm going to engage that transformation loop on my Garda Hitch Footloop. We've got a dedicated video on creating it and what it does. But I can change the length of my Garda hitch such that it's significantly shorter. I find I don't need to use any length other than this for my Garda hitch. I'll put that on and I'll attach my best friend loop. Now, when I'm climbing this way, you generally have a short bridge. I use this method when I'm using my hitch climbing, and I use this method when I am stick climbing. Believe it or not, stick climbing, I use the same method, a very short bridge and a short Garda. So let's see what would happen if I got in trouble with a friction hitch failure in this situation. An important distinction here is when I climb this way, if you could see what's going on here on this carabiner, whenever I climb this way, I always get the carabiner to engage not only the friction hitch, but the rope itself. And that's important because it brings some other possibilities into play. So right now, I'll go up one more step. Right now, if I had a problem and this friction hitch started to slide, now generally speaking, when a friction hitch starts to slide, you feel it. And so the instinctive thing to do is to arrest it by putting a little bit more weight on your foot. So here's my friction hitch, it's sliding. Well, I'm stopping it with my foot. How am I going to recover from this situation? Well, all I really need to do is allow myself to get in the same situation I was in scenario 1. I want my best friend to be loaded. How do I let that happen? Well, what I do is I lengthen my upper bridge. I lengthen my upper bridge because I'm having trouble with that friction hitch. And I lengthen my upper bridge, and look, I get myself down into a position where my best friend is holding me. Let's bring that friction hitch down. And now I can repair and replace this. Now I'm not going to do this a second time. I'm not going to tie this. You get the idea. It was slipping. I retied it. I clipped back into it. But let's say because this foot loop is so short, I'm in a position now where I don't have the strength. I mean, I do. I could stand here, but let's say you couldn't. Well, that's the beauty of this transformation loop. I can simply open the Garda hitch carabiners, lengthen my foot loop. So now I've got that original geometry and I can recover. Do whatever you need to do to lengthen your bridge. And you can see I've recovered. And at this point I could rappel, I could do whatever I needed to do. Again, see the video, single rope rappel on the Munzer friction hitch. Okay, so here we are. Scenario 3 is the same as scenario 2. But let's say that when this friction hitch went, it went all of a sudden, or I wasn't prepared for it, and a terrible thing happened. And that terrible thing is this carabiner came down and got itself tangled up. We never want these to contact each other. But let's say it happened. Let's say, and this can happen, that these got intertwined and to a point where I'm in trouble. I can't break this, and I'm powerless to raise myself up. What can I do? Let's say I can't even open the gates on my Garda. I'm really in trouble. How can I get out of this situation? Well, my best friend is not loaded, right? It's not loaded. Everything is still loaded here. And so what I can do is I can recover by installing a new friction hitch above. Now, What friction hitch are you going to use? Well, that's up to you. You might carry, you'll recall my video on the head and knot. You might be bringing a Prusik loop with you. The thing I don't love about Prusik loops is they're just never quite the right length. I tend to carry a Longhorn loop. And so let's go ahead and finish this scenario. Let's build a head and knot above. Again, I'm not in any rush here. I'm not in any pain. There's no rush to get this done. Okay, so I've got my head in and it's above my other friction hitch. What I need to do now, I'm removing my best friend loop. Take my foot out of here, I can relax. I need to lengthen this bridge. It's one of the reasons where I always recommend having a little bit of extra line on your bridge. Even if you've got to consume it in an ugly loop, in an emergency situation, if I needed my short bridge to get a little longer, I can do so. So I've taken out that long emergency stopper, and I'm going to lengthen my short bridge. Okay, my short bridge is now longer, and I've got it attached to that new friction hitch. Now I've got to get my weight here. How will I do so? Let's assume this Garda is all jammed up. I can't open the gates. Well, that's the reason when I created it that I used a Longhorn hitch to create the transformation loop, because it's so easy to tie and so easy to untie. I can remove the transformation loop simply by untying it, and I'm back to full length on the Garda. Now, I don't ever expect to need that trick in my entire climbing career, but I'm prepared for it. I just removed the transformation loop. My Garda is now full length, and I can step into it. Right? Now it's simple. Now just stand up and move this up. And look what I've done. I've transferred my weight to the head and knot. And whatever went wrong here, because there's no load on it, I can get rid of it. I can get rid of all that. And now I can safely rappel. I will simply switch bridges. The roll of my bridges has changed. The short bridge is the upper bridge, what normally would be the short bridge, and what is normally the long bridge is my lower bridge, but I can engage a munter, and if you can't break your head in, right, because a head and knot is not easily broken, we still have the Garda if we want to put a foot loop here on our Garda, but if you've got a decent strength profile, it's this easy for me to just stand up, break it. See my video on recovery after loss of footing. I gave you a lot of options to how to get weight on your feet, but now I can simply rappel. Okay, so this last scenario is the same as scenario 3, but I'm going to assume that the climber is unprepared. The climber did not have an emergency piece of equipment, an emergency cord to tie an auxiliary friction hitch. So again, an unexpected event occurred that caused not only my friction hitch to slide, but for it to slam into the Garda, and for these devices to become infused to the point where I can't break them, right? This is slid, and I have no way to repair it. It's broken, and I have no emergency supplies. Now, if you're not comfortable executing this move, you shouldn't do so. You consider calling for a rescue if that's possible. But I want to show you how I can confidently get out of this situation, if only to provoke thought. And what I'm going to do is I am going to simply get myself under this contraption and abandon it. I am no longer concerned about my system. I'm concerned about my butt. I need to get it to ground safely. And here's how I'm going to do so. I can take my foot out of the foot loop, and And this is the nice thing about having a bridge like mine with the Longhorn Agile, is that I can lengthen my bridge. I can lengthen my bridge. Here is my short bridge. I'm going to form a munter here. Now, I can't fully demonstrate this scenario without making permanent damage to my system. But now that I have a munter and I'm prepared to rappel on it, I just need to transfer my weight on it. And it's likely I can do so by simply lengthening my upper bridge, as I just did. And it's likely I can still remove this carabiner. It's likely. Let's test that. But in a worst case scenario, if I had to whip out my emergency knife and cut my upper bridge, if I had to, I would. Now, again, I think that's unlikely, but it's possible. So I was able to remove this. But if I fiddled and fussed in the way that these things were fused together, I wasn't able to. Well, look what I've done. My weight is on this munter. All of this business, I'm gonna leave that in the tree. I'm gonna come back and get that tomorrow with a buddy and maybe a ladder. You get the point. I'm able to recover, but I've got no backup, so I'll rappel very slowly and carefully. All right, guys, so I'm trying to make sure that I am abiding by the same principles that I've given you in earlier videos about thinking about what can go wrong. And after we've thought about what can go wrong, we have to think about how we can recover. You can use these concepts in any style of climbing. For example, I spent a fair amount of my climbing career going up in ladder stands and wearing a fall arrest harness. And I never actually thought about what would happen if my tree stand collapsed and I was hanging from a fall arrest harness with a Prusik loop way over my head. I didn't have a way to get out of that situation. You probably don't have a way to get out of that situation. We'll cover that in another video. My point is that we're thinking about the entire failure sequence of events, and we're thinking about not only preventing a fall, but also ensuring that we can get to ground safely at all times. And the principles I've given you remain intact. I always want a line in the tree. I always want to make sure it reaches the ground. Tethers are not for saddle hunters. Sorry, you'll have to get over it. A lifeline is what you need if you are in a tree. And secondly, I want to make sure you're managing slack and you've got 2 points of connection to that rope. You got 2 bridges on your saddle. If you're paying attention to what's going on in the arborist world, arborist saddles these days are more and more of them are coming out of the factory with 2 bridges. There's a lot of scenarios which 2 bridges enable, and some of them have to do with safety and self-rescue. Thanks as always for your support. I look forward to referring to this video from future videos on both hitch climbing and stick climbing, because I'll be using a Garda hitch and a lifeline on both. Thank you.